So obviously the First World War was long. It was fought for 4 years. There was an enormous number of battles fought both on the Eastern and Western Front, as well as other various theatres of war scattered around the Middle East as well. And of course the conflict between the various colonies. But I just want to talk about a couple of key battles in the nature of this conflict, just to give you some kind of sense of what war was actually like during the First World War. So this will not be an exhaustive retelling of every single battle of the First World War. Really, I'm just going to look at 2 or 3 in this slide. So on the Western Front, as I already mentioned, the war was characterised by, on the one hand, heavily armed defensive positions, trenches protected by machine guns, and barbed wire, very, very thick barbed wire that was quite difficult to cut. And these defensive positions were pitted against essentially men charging across no man's land, trying to break into these trenches. So both sides were guilty of essentially sending thousands of soldiers to their deaths in hopelessly organised charges that had very little chance of success. And this particularly was a weakness of the French commanders in 1914 and 1915, who were very determined to try and repulse the Germans out of France, and oftentimes suffered quite bad casualties. So I want to just mention a couple of battles. One, so by 1916, after this kind of series of slaughters, the German High Commander was a guy called Erich von Falkenhayn. And von Falkenhayn had calculated, he basically had figured out, look, there's no way we are ever going to outcharge, or we're going to charge through and capture these trenches. But if we're going to win this war, we're going to have to win a war of attrition. We're going to have to essentially make conditions where, yes, we will take high casualties, but if we can guarantee that the British and French are taking higher casualties, that will essentially be a win for us. So warfare by 1916 has been reduced to simply winning the body count, as opposed to actually tactical manoeuvres and making breakthroughs and pushing your enemy back. So von Falkenhayn had decided to attack Verdun. Verdun was a town in eastern France. It was protected by a series of fortifications. It had long been the kind of centerpiece of the French defensive fortifications, and going back centuries. So Verdun particularly had symbolically important value to the French, and von Falkenhayn understood that. And his basic plan was, if we can attack Verdun, the French, because they will not want to lose Verdun, because Verdun holds such a high place, an important place in the French psyche, and as a kind of source of morale and encouragement, because the French will not want to lose Verdun and will pay whatever cost it requires in terms of men and blood to keep Verdun, we can basically ensure that, yes, we'll take high casualties, but we will inflict more casualties upon them. I mean, specifically what von Falkenhayn was talking about, he called this tactic trying to bleed France to death, that the French will commit very, very high casualties in trying to protect Verdun. He calculated basically that for every 2 German soldiers who would be killed at the Battle of Verdun, 5 French soldiers would be killed. And he felt that in the long run, that war of attrition would suit the Germans, not the French, because the Germans had a bigger army, the Germans had a bigger population, and that this essentially would force the French to look for peace terms as a result. So the German attack on Verdun began in February 1916, and initially it was actually very successful. They captured several of the forts around Verdun. The French, exactly as von Falkenhayn had predicted, began committing enormous numbers of men to try and reclaim these forts of Verdun, to try and protect Verdun. The French commanders at Verdun was Marshal Pétain and General George Nivelle, and both of them became famous for, Robert Nivelle. Both of them became famous for their cry of "They shall not pass," as in, no matter what happens, there is no way we are surrendering Verdun to the Germans. And the result was, ultimately, the battle went on for 9 or 10 months. It left over 300,000 men dead. That's just the fatalities. Several hundred thousand more badly wounded. Although von Falkenhayn's correct predictions initially were relatively correct, at least that the French were taking much higher casualties. But as the battle dragged on, those casualties began to equalise. So of that 300,000, there was a majority of them were French, but it was not nearly as a devastating imbalance as von Falkenhayn had predicted. And so the Battle of Verdun marked essentially nothing changes. 300,000 men dead in this battle, and no real strategic change or difference in the outcome of the war. The British also tried an offensive, and unlike the Germans, who had to some extent come to realise that breakthroughs were all but impossible, the British did believe a breakthrough was impossible. And in July 1916, they launched a massive offensive at the Somme, partly to relieve the pressure upon the French at Verdun, partly because the British under General Haig believed that they could achieve a breakthrough. And the slaughter at the Somme, frankly, was astonishing. So 20,000 men were killed on the very first day. 20,000 British men, British soldiers, not talking about the German casualties, just the British casualties. 20,000 British soldiers die on the first day. Just to give you an example of a couple of statistics to put that in context. Firstly, the 1st Newfoundland Regiment, a Canadian regiment that fought at the Somme, they took part in the initial attack on July 1st, 1916. There were 752 men in the 1st Newfoundland Regiment. And within 40 minutes, so just the first 40 minutes of the battle, 26 officers and 658 men were killed and wounded. So leaving basically less than 100 men either alive and unwounded within 40 minutes of the battle beginning. The British lost more soldiers in the first 3 days of the Somme than American soldiers who died in the First World War, the Korean War, and the Vietnamese War combined. Or, to another perspective, the British lost more soldiers in those first 3 days or 3 times as many soldiers in those first 3 days than they lost in the entirety of the wars against Napoleon in the late 18th and early 19th century. So this was simply a slaughter on an unimaginable historical scale. And the end result is that nothing is achieved, that the British are unable to actually break through the German defences. The battle goes on for several months. Again, just as the Battle of Verdun, we're left with about 300,000 men on both sides dead. Although obviously the initial pace of slaughter endured by the British faded after the first couple of days because they simply couldn't keep up the wave of attacks on the German trenches. The war on the Eastern Front was not fought in these kind of terms. The war on the Eastern Front was different, partly because Eastern Europe was simply much wider. It was much easier for armies to manoeuvre. It was much harder to dig trenches that covered all of Eastern Europe. So it was notable as a war of much more movement than stalemate. And on the Eastern Front, you basically had part of the German army and the Austro-Hungarian army fighting against the Russian army. The Russians had mobilized an enormous army, almost 12 million soldiers. But the problem was they were often poorly armed, poorly trained, and they were fighting against German army in particular. The Austrian army didn't particularly cover itself in glory in this war, and partly because of the multinational, multi-ethnic makeup of the Austrian Empire. Many of the people in the Austrian army were Slavs, Poles, Croats, Czechs, some Serbs, and most of them did not want to fight against the Russians. So the Austrian army was essentially all but useless in the war against Russia, but the German army, which certainly was well commanded. The picture here is actually of the two men on horses were the German commanders of Paul von Hindenburg. He's the guy who the famous Hindenburg balloon was named after because he later becomes president of Germany, and Erich Ludendorff. Under the command of von Hindenburg and Ludendorff, the Germans inflict terrible casualties upon the Russians. At the Battle of Tannenberg, for example, which was fought in September 1914, a battle which in some ways might have cost Germany the war because they had to redivert forces east to fight the Russians. But at Tannenberg, the Germans surrounded a Russian army of 200,000 men and captured or killed 125,000 of them. So the Russians remain in the war, but oftentimes are being forced to retreat by the Germans in particular. So the nature of the war is somewhat different on the Eastern Front as it is from the Western Front. And again, I don't want to go into too much detail about the course of the war, so I just want to talk to you a little bit about how the end. So essentially we have the early movement of 1914, the kind of slaughter in the trenches from late 1914 into early 1918, and then finally a little more movement and the war comes to an end. So in 1917, after the kind of failure at Verdun, the German commanders realized they needed to do something to win the war. The Germans have been criticized for their kind of campaign of unlimited, unrestricted submarine warfare because especially as they attacked American ships, they were trying to supply the United Kingdom. And they stopped doing it for most of 1916, but by 1917, they had to take a risk. They basically calculated, well, let's try and use our submarines to destroy the British fleet and starve the United Kingdom to death. And hopefully, we're willing to risk war with the United States because otherwise we're not going to win this war. We're certainly never going to break through and defeat the British and French as things are going. That obviously brought the United States into the war in 1917, in April 1917. However, the Germans received a boon that in 1917, that same year, revolution broke out in Russia. And I'll talk more about the Russian Revolution in our next class. Revolution initially broke out in Russia in February 1917 with the Tsar being overthrown, and then a communist takeover took place in Russia in October 1917, and the communists decided to withdraw Russia from the war in order to focus on building a new communist society in Russia. So by late 1917, the situation for Germany is very simple. The United States have entered the war, but the United States, at least in early 1917, does not have a very large army. So American help will come for the Allies, but it will probably not be until 1918 that a large number of American soldiers will be able to join the Allied war effort. The Russians, on the other hand, have been knocked out of the war. So basically the Germans transfer all their soldiers from the Eastern Front to the West and decide to make one last push to try and achieve a breakthrough before American soldiers can kind of tip the balance in favour of the Allies. And command of the army is put under Ludendorff, who I mentioned was one of the commanders in Eastern Germany, and he came up with a new tactic. So basically, Ludendorff realised that it was possible to get initial small breakthroughs before the defences kind of closed around and stop the Allies. So Ludendorff decided to organise his soldiers into kind of mobile columns that would seek to punch through the Allied lines and make some kind of headway. And as soon as the Allies kind of plugged up that gap, he transferred the soldiers somewhere else and attacked a different weak point on the Allied front. And because of this, the Germans actually have an awful lot of success. So the Germans launched what's called Operation Michael, their last campaign to try and defeat the Allies in spring of 1918. And initially, based on Ludendorff's tactics of kind of increased mobility, of moving around on the front and not, it's trying to get bogged down fighting over a couple of miles of territory, the Germans have success. In fact, they pushed back to within 30 miles of Paris once more. And so by June of 1918, a German victory in the war is not impossible. However, July 1918, Ludendorff's attack, his latest attack, fails. And with that, the Germans essentially have committed all their reserves, they've committed all their supplies. There is no backup plan for the Germans if they can't break through. Once the Allies stop the Germans in July 1918 and start pushing them back, the German commanders know the war is over. They simply haven't the reserves to fight on. Ludendorff advises the German government to try and make peace as quickly as it can because the war, they're essentially beaten. So the French, the British and the Americans start pushing the German army back from July 1918 onwards. Ludendorff essentially becomes something of a military dictator in Germany. He allows a democratic government to form in Germany to try and negotiate peace with the Allies, especially with Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had published his 14 points offering kind of potential terms for peace. The Germans liked the sound of the 14 points because they weren't particularly punitive towards the Germans. So they tried to negotiate with Wilson in particular, the American president, to get a peace deal kind of behind the back of the French and the British. By November 1918, society is collapsing in Germany. Soldiers have started mutinying. There's riots in the street. And a republic is declared. The German Kaiser William, abdicates, flees to the Netherlands, and a German democratic government seizes control and begins negotiating for peace. And the result is an armistice was signed on November 11th, 1918, bringing the war to an end. So we'll talk more about the peace in a second. But again, the scope of the war: 9 million soldiers killed between 1914 and 1918, 20 million wounded, and then another 6.5 million missing in action. Essentially most of them assumed to be dead, and their bodies kind of obliterated during the conflict. So an enormously devastating war. Up until this point, the bloodiest war that humankind had ever seen.